And we must remember that for most of the existence of man, the word God was not used. And yet, man had a great spirituality and a great affinity for the concept that man would later call God. Africa recognized that there was a spiritual force in the universe. He knew he could not make the rain, change the seasons. He could not make a hurricane, and he could not stop one. So he recognized that this force in the world was in charge, was a force bigger than himself. And he tried to bring man in harmony with nature, as against Western man, who often tries to defy nature. But he did not use the word God, and yet he recognized the spiritual force in the world that man would later call God.
Dr. Clarke, I've often heard throughout the years that this word God is used in the English word language. Is actually the word dog spelled backwards.
Yes, and man was late in using it. And whether this is coincidental, I do not know. But it is somewhat ironical that that is the case, because the God concept that we know came out of the conference at Nicaea in Europe, 325 AD. But the spiritual concept was always there, recognized by the African, who thought that the spiritual force that ruled the universe was in everything that lives. Therefore, the African would meditate sometime before cutting down a tree, because a tree was a part of life. It only cut down what he needed. And he thought that the spiritual force of the universe was in the water, so he could stand by the water and meditate or pray, or in a tree, and he could stand by the tree or in himself, so he could meditate within himself. And so he did not need a church as such, and he did not need someone to intervene between himself and the spiritual force of the universe, because he thought that he was a part of that totality and he could communicate directly.
Now, Dr. Clarke, what is the difference between religion and spirituality?
Religion is an artificial form that came later when man organized spirituality into forms and denomination, into concepts. And each group tried to prove that their concept was the true concept and the one most entitled to prevail. Now you see hypocrisy entering spirituality and killing its meaning. Now, spirituality is the recognition of the spiritual force of the universe and the recognition of your relationship toward all living things and your responsibility toward all living things. I have examined a lot of African indigenous belief systems, and most of them are based on African spirituality as against religions. And in spirituality, you do not discriminate. Your wife can belong to one version of it, you can belong to another, and there's no conflict between you based on that. And this was carried over into the United States because within my own family, I got nearly everything except the Catholic. I might have them now when I didn't have them in my growing up days, but we had Methodists and Holy Rollers and Sanctified people, although we were predominantly Baptists. We were predominantly Baptists, and even our best religious jokes were about the Methodists because they got sprinkled instead of being immersed in the water. See, with the coming of religion and denominations and churches and ministers, economics entered. Commerce entered. To have a church, you got to have someone to build the church. The church has to be maintained. To have a preacher, he has to be maintained. So once commerce entered, the Bible, the religion became a money-making entity with all of its pretense of holiness. And it could not sustain itself without funds. So it became a fundraising gimmick. And I say that going away from spirituality, which is the recognition of all living things in their worth, when in religion, you give preference to your chosen denomination and people who adhere to your chosen denomination. Religion has a sense of prejudice throughout. In fact, nearly all religions are violations of the God concept by dictionary definition. Because if you take the dictionary definition of God, God is kind, God is gracious, and God is nonpartisan, which is just the opposite of religions. A Catholic will not concede that a Protestant is right or can be right. That's ungodly.
It certainly is.
So when you deal with the ungodly nature of religion, the Protestant nature of religions, the Protestant nature of religion, you can find out that religions violate, sometimes by their very being, the concept of God.